Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University. This is our second video for week 3 of the course Principles of Interface Design. In this second video, let's focus on the screen design principles and issues around proximity, alignment, repetition, and typography. In this video, let's focus on the issues and then the techniques to address proximity, alignment, and repetition, and then let's focus on fonts and typography as used in individual screen designs. And then don't miss session 3, where we're going to talk about designing PowerPoint presentations. Let's begin by examining the design elements of proximity, alignment, and repetition. The design principle of proximity refers to taking different individual elements. Now, they could be text, they could be graphics, and moving them closer to each other so that they are in relationship with each other. They appear to be a cohesive group versus looking like a group of unrelated items. Here, I'm taking the liberty of designing my own business card. And notice on this business card, no element on this page seems to have a relationship with any other element. The 4 outlying elements are all the same size, the same font, the same color, and they're all separated by space. The item in the middle, which is the name of the university, is large and is bold-faced, so the eye will start there, but then the eye doesn't know where to go after this. Now here I'm taking the same business card and I'm going to try to raise the visibility of my name on the card. The problem is that I didn't move anything in any place. We still don't have any connection with any of these elements. And because only one of the 4 outside elements is bold, this even confuses the relationship between the elements, the proximity, even more. In this version, you can see that there are 2 definite elements here. We have one element by proximity on the top and another element by proximity on the bottom. Now the eye sees 2 distinct units. There's definitely more design here. A person can see where to go and what they're looking at. The material on the top is related. The material on the bottom, that's all an address and phone number and such, so that's related. In this version, we made it just a little bit better. First, I wasn't happy with the overall balance of the last one. The heavy element, the Misericordia name, was on the top of the card. So it would be nicer if the heavier element was down on the bottom to balance more. So here we see that we did that balancing, and we achieved proximity by grouping like elements together, put them in close proximity to each other and their groups. And by doing this design, I created a C path. So the eye starts with my name and then travels around in a curve and ends up at the word Misericordia University. And again, the heavy element is at the bottom. The lighter elements are up at the top. So this is a much better design. Here, there is no proximity. None of these elements seem to have a relationship with each other at all. And there's no path here. So we refer to this where there's a lot of empty space. We call this trapped white space because it's just kind of strewn about without any plan. In this version, notice that there is grouping here. There is proximity. I simply grouped the 2 elements, the what's happening, the name of the place, so they're related elements. We have the graphics, and then we've got the other particulars down on the bottom. By doing this, you could see it's much more organized, and it's a good design, and the importance of all this, the bottom line is to make this comfortable for the user who's going to look at this screen, or in this case, this card. So much more easy to understand and to just get the true meaning out of what the text is by seeing the organization of it on the screen. In this first text box, notice how there are a lot of individual elements all sitting together. There's no relationship here. They're just one big list of materials. If you place something like this as part of a screen design, it will be very difficult for your learners to understand what this is. They would really have to read every individual element and process it. Now compare it with this second text box. Notice by using proximity, by using the headings, I used also larger font for the headings, underline and boldface. This is very easy to understand, and a user can interpret this material, this content, much more quickly and much more easily than the first text box. A second design principle would be alignment. Alignment refers to having a visual connection with every item on the page. The concept is don't ever just place things anywhere, but place them in a carefully designed pattern. Even if you have separate, disparate elements, you can indicate their relationship or their proximity by aligning them, and that indicates to the reader that, oh, well, these things are related, that they all have a relationship to one another. Let's take a look at some examples. Going back to a business card design. Now, don't pay attention to the fact that I have the heavier element on top. Let's look at the proximity of everything here. Notice that all these elements, first of all, there's proximity because of the top and the bottom set of elements. But the right alignment indicates that, well, all of these elements are related together because they're all aligned to the right, as opposed to left aligned or centering. On this simulated title page for a business plan, everything looks good. There is some proximity here of two different sets of elements, as you typically do when you're creating a title page. But notice everything is organized so, like, in an expected fashion. It's centered. It's everything you would expect. It tends to be just kind of common and ordinary. Nothing wrong with it, but it's common, ordinary, and boring. Let's compare it with a different type of alignment. In the previous example, I right-aligned all of the text elements. Here, I left-aligned all of the text elements. So notice, just by creating that alignment, that everybody's following, every element is following that same alignment pattern, it does appear that everything is connected. And here, because of this, it looks more dramatic. It's more bold. It makes more of a loud statement rather than just plain and boring and ordinary centered text. On this simulated poster, everything is balanced, everything is centered, and it looks good. It's stable. But you could create an artistic effect to make it less boring and less common and make it more dramatic. Here, I am still centering the elements, although I've moved the centering line over more to the right and forced like a false margin on the left with that big, bold, black bar that's coming down. So they're centered, but they're more dramatic. Notice that when we're looking at these design elements of a proximity and alignment, we're not just looking at what's balanced and what's comfortable. We're also balancing that with excitement and interest to hold the attention of the learner. Notice that in that process, we're making artistic decisions and trying to convey certain feelings, certain excitement, certain interest through these use of these elements. Here, this is much more dramatic. We could even make it more dramatic than this. If I were to reverse the color, still it's centered text, but notice the centering line is pushed off to the right, and now I've reversed the colors of the font and the background. Now that's even a more dramatic statement. So notice the artistry with which we're doing this, because we are trying to engage the learner more. I want the reader to really get the gist of the message here, and we're showing it through artistry and design. Let's take a look at one final example of alignment. Here we're looking at two different elements, and we can tell they're two different elements because of the proximity, and the alignment up top is on the left. So that's dramatic. You can see the relationship there. On the bottom, though, while that's centered, there doesn't seem to be, there are two different distinct elements here, but there doesn't seem to be a relationship between the top element and the bottom element. Now, if we were to align the two different elements differently, here I'd still have the top element aligned to the left. Now I've got the bottom element aligned to the right. You can see that it's more highly organized, and you can feel the relationship because of the left-hand side border and the right-hand side alignment. You can feel that there's a relationship between these two elements. So not only is the text still presenting the same statement, but now the design of the text, the way it appears to the learner or to the user, is conveying those relationships and doing it with some drama and some artistry as well. So it's holding the interest of the learner as well as conveying the message even more effectively. In addition to proximity and alignment, let's also consider the design element of repetition. And repetition simply means repeating some element on the screen. The repeated element could be anything. It could be boldface, it could be a line, a colored bar, it could be a type of bullet, it could be the use of color or a particular format or some spatial relationship between elements. It's anything that can be visually recognized as something that is being repeated. Repeated elements will help the user to understand the unity, the relationship between the various elements, and it also causes visual interest to a screen or to a page. Here we have a series of elements. We do have them right aligned. We do have proximity between a top group and a bottom group, which is positive, but we could make it even more interesting, because right now there's nothing to really kind of cause your eye to go in certain places or add interest to it. Here you see repeated both boldface and also an underline. So both of those elements add interest, and the repetition of them interests the eye to bounce between those two sets of elements. As shown in a previous example, rather than listing out a whole bunch of unrelated individual items of text, here we organize them through proximity. But we can make this even better. If we were to use repetition on the boldface and also the underline elements, again, it makes it more organized, it makes it more interesting, and the user's eye is tempted to now bounce between all of those repeated elements to further and better understand the text that's contained on this part of the screen. Let's now turn our attention to fonts and typography. Since the beginning of desktop publishing, fonts have just exploded. There are so many fonts that someone can use in any electronic application. Considering all of this plethora of font availability, It's important for a designer to take a look at functionality and readability when you're selecting fonts for any type of a technology-based educational application. Broadly, we typically classify fonts in one of three categories. The first category is a serif font. So a serif refers to the little angled or short lines, like the other strokes of the pen, that are attached to the actual letter. So this was based on the hand lettering of scribes from ages ago. And it really mimics just the natural things that occur when you're using the old types of pens that they used. Now, until most recently, this was normally determined to be the easiest type of font to read. And fonts that are examples of this are Times New Roman, or Times, or Garamond. But as of late, another type of font classification is kind of like neck and neck with this in terms of functionality and readability. And that classification of fonts is called sans serif fonts. So sans meaning you don't have them. We don't have those little serifs. We don't have those little ends of the strokes of the letters. Now, traditionally, these fonts were used in calling attention to different parts of text. So, for example, a title or a heading, but it normally wasn't used for just the regular main body of text. So fonts like Calibri and Arial and Helvetica. But now we're finding that because so many applications are using the sans serif fonts in place of the serif fonts, the readability is becoming a whole lot easier for the typical user. The third classification of font is a script font, or a fancy font. And these are fancy, and they're designed to appear as if they've been hand-lettered or very artistically written. So they're effective if you're trying to create a sense of elegance. For example, if you receive a formal invitation to a wedding, sometimes they're difficult to read. And some of those fonts, like as used on an invitation, require the receiver of that invitation to really read hard, like to read, put a lot of diligent effort in order to just decipher what the text is about. Italics is another example of a script font. Now, all of these fonts, especially italics, tend to highlight or call attention to something that's important or significant. And that's good. And you can certainly use these fonts in that way. Just be careful not to overuse, especially for large amounts of standard regular body text, because of the difficulty of reading and deciphering those fonts. Let's take a look at some text written in all three of these different font classifications. So here we're using a serif font. Notice how the little serifs, like in Times New Roman, they kind of connect the words together. We've been talking about proximity. These little serifs tend to group the letters of a word in proximity to one another. So historically, this was one of the easiest type of font to read. Let's compare it with the next example. Here's the same text, however, it's in a sans serif font. There aren't little serifs here. There's no connectors. Notice that it's a little harder, a little more difficult to differentiate the individual words. It looks different to the eye. But keep in mind that while in the past I would have said this is okay to use and it's better to use just for titles and headings and elements like that, at this point in time, because of their proliferation of use, people are becoming very comfortable with the sans serif font as well. Here I have formatted that same text in italics. Now, while it looks elegant, if you take the time to read this, you'll find it actually physically takes you longer to read through this because we're not used to reading large amounts of text in any type of fancy font. So consider the way that you're going to use fonts We certainly want to maintain consistency and comfortableness and normalcy. So if your users are used to reading the serif and or the sans serif fonts, uh, why not use those more often rather than fancy fonts like scripts? When you're composing text within any type of electronic application, be sure to use normal punctuation and normal expected capitalization. Realize that users read fastest when the text is printed in upper and lower case, the way we normally see it written in a book. And also, don't use all caps or title case. Title case is when you take the first letter of each word and capitalize that for normal large blocks of text. Realize that places like magazines and newspapers, sometimes they will use some like fancy variations on capitalization, and they're doing that to slow the reader down on purpose. They want to emphasize a few words. But notice it's only a few words. It's not an entire block of text. Let's look at some examples. Here is an example of a large block of text using all uppercase with the caps lock on. Notice this is hard to read in the sense that it will take you more time to physically read through this block of text. Another example, if I were to ask you how many sentences appear here, you kind of really have to search. You have to look around for the period. It's more difficult to see. Here you see the same text, but instead of all caps, we're using title case, which simply means that every letter is capitalized. Again, it's hard to read. It takes you longer to read. If I were to ask you how many sentences here, it's probably going to be easier to determine that with title case rather than all caps. But still, we're not used to reading this way, so it's going to be a not a leisurely experience to read this text. And finally, we're looking at sentence case, whereas we capitalize the first letter of the first word, then we don't capitalize again unless there are proper nouns being implemented there. If I were to ask you to read this and time you, this would take the least amount of time for you to read compared to the previous two examples. Also, if I were to ask you how many sentences are here, you could pick them out pretty quickly. It's much easier to read because this is what we normally read. So do plan in all applications to use sentence case and not the other two that we previously looked at, sentence and all caps, unless you're going for some special effect to purposely slow the reader down and to call attention to that text. Make sure that the font size that you use is large enough to be easily read. Now the other side of this is, if you find that your font size is getting too small on any screen, it's probably indicating that you're trying to jam too much text on that screen. So lighten it up a little bit and use a larger font size. Ensure that the text is able to be read over the background. We'll consider this more when we start looking at universal design in learning principles. You may have to tone down the background. You might have to change the font color. Make it easy to read. And we'll look at some examples. Avoid the use of those fancy fonts. In the electronic world, avoid things like blinking text and things that can be just downright annoying and also can be disturbing to certain student users, people with disabilities. Unless you are using alignment in order to create proximity and relationship between different elements of text, and normally that's done in like on title pages and for different effect on certain screens. In general, when you're using larger blocks of text, align the text left. And also, in general, do not justify the text. In other words, don't have the left and the right margin perfectly straight, because we're not used to reading that way. That's actually very uncomfortable for users to read in that fashion. Now, the justification looks neat, it looks nice, but it yields slower reading time, and then it tends to tire out the user. Here's an example of justified text. Notice the right and the left margins are perfect. Now, how does the computerized device make this happen? Well, if you take a look, you can notice that especially on the second line in this example, the device is separating out and spacing out the text in order to make that right margin perfectly even. That's what tends to slow people down. That's not the way we're used to reading things. Further, research has shown that when you just left justify the text, as shown in this example, the way that we're used to reading, that this gives the visual cues to the learner so the learner remembers, oh, this is where I was at. I was on the end of the second line, and that third line kind of dipped in a little farther on the right-hand side, and so on. So it makes it easier to keep track of where you're at when you're reading the text. So in general, left justify all larger blocks of text that you're going to use on screens. On a screen, do not hyphenate words in a line of text, because that makes certainly be more efficient in terms of the use of space, but that works better in print. For the screens, it makes it more difficult to read and much more difficult for the user to understand. And also, we're used to indenting a first line of a paragraph on a paper, but do not do that typically on a computer screen or any kind of electronic screen. This really helps the printed page, but it makes it more difficult and longer to read on the screen. Having looked at various ways to achieve overall balance on a screen, let's also fine-tune and let's look at balance in terms of the length of lines of text within a paragraph. Remember that the part of the concept of balance is that the heavier things, the heavier, like the longer elements or the larger elements, tend to go comfortably on the bottom of the screen, and the shorter or the lighter elements tend to go up on the top. Notice how this block of text is arranged in pyramid style. And when we look at a pyramid, we know that that's a natural balance that we see in the world. Notice how the lighter elements are on top, the heavier or the larger, or in this case longer, elements appear toward the bottom. So this appears more natural to us. And to do this, we have to force a line break. So in applications such as presentation software like PowerPoint or Google Slides, or if we're doing something in print-based like in Word or Google Docs, we have to do is hold the Shift key and press the Enter in order to not create a whole new paragraph, but rather just force a line break at that point in time. Let's compare with the text on the next block, on the next slide here. Notice how this block of text, this paragraph, appears to be upside down. It just doesn't look right. Something looks out of place here. It's an upside down pyramid. So this is not at all what we see in the natural world. The text appears awkward. So the line length can really throw off the reader. A little more subtle, but when we look at the balance in the title, for example, on a PowerPoint slide or a Google Docs slide, this example shows something that's out of balance here. Like there's a big heavy element in the title, and it's stacked on top of a very small element. In this example, the title looks more proportionate. It looks more balanced. Again, the way that a designer can achieve this is by, at the end of, in this case, the word "the" in the title, I held the Shift key and pressed the Enter key on a computer keyboard, and that will force a line break without creating a whole new paragraph. So let's quickly look at how to balance the text on this PowerPoint slide. The first thing I notice is that this text is justified. So the text is aligned on the right as well as the left. We mentioned the principles of design that state that while this looks nice from afar, this is not the way we're used to reading. And it actually hurts our visual cues to remember where we were on which line we left off when we were reading. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to deal with this paragraph, and I'm going to change that from justified to left aligned. Now, having done that, okay, now this is more reasonable in terms of the way we're used to reading. Then what I can do is, as a designer, I would like to, in general, have, now I could certainly go for a pyramid shape, but in general, we're not going to do that on every slide. But look at this last line. This last line is just kind of, looks very imbalanced here, because you've got all this heavy stuff, so to speak, sitting and resting on top of this little bit of text. So what we have to do is make more text down here. So I could start up top here, and I'll hit the Shift Enter, and as I do Shift Enter, what I'm going to do is I'm going to force a line break, and still notice the lines are jagged on the right side, and that's good. And I can undo this last one. Maybe I could take, maybe I'll put one more word down here, and then up here, why don't I take some of this? Now that looks more reasonable in terms of balance. It doesn't have to be perfectly balanced, but what we don't want is to have the user feel like if I were to put one word on the bottom here, that really gives that feeling that this is not a balanced set of text at all. So overall, this will be more aesthetically pleasing, and while it seems like a subtle point, it really does impact the learner and his or her feelings as they go through looking at this material. Let's review by looking at two Word documents, and let's consider proximity, alignment, and repetition, and how it can really positively or negatively impact our work. So here we have something that's going to be a poster. You can see various text here. The text all looks the same. It's all uniform. There's a graphic on the bottom, which is positive. But let's take a better look. Maybe there's a better way that we can work this through. Now, look at the call attention up here with the larger text element. Notice the proximity that's happening here. Notice the repetition of the boldface items. So just the proximity, the repetition, this is really helping. And then there's a graphic down here to draw attention down to the bottom of the page. That's a much more positive design than the first one that we saw. Let's look at another example. So here's an example of what would be again, a poster in this case, an invitation for people to attend a concert. Now there's a lot of information on this page. Now there is, this top element is highlighted. It's bold-faced and larger, and that's positive to draw attention to it. Everything else is the same, and there's all kinds of different information here, dates, different musical selections, and there's a graphic over here, which is positive. But let's see if we can use those elements of design to make this more outstanding and more understandable. First of all, let me just scroll down a little bit so you can get the whole picture. Now, you can immediately see the repetition of these important elements. You can see the proximity happening here. Notice how dramatic this poster is compared to the first one that we considered. And look at this dramatic graphic. It was a good graphic before, but now it's really dramatic, and even because we washed it out and it's a background graphic, so it's not competing with these text elements, but it's extra dramatic at this point. So look how using these design elements can make such a positive difference when we're designing anything, whether it's PowerPoint, whether it's something that we've designed in an application like Visual Basic, or some other language or development platform, or even something that's going to go into print. To briefly summarize, in our first video of class session number 3, we considered how to create a path for the eye to follow on a screen. In this video, we just considered the issues involved and the techniques of proximity, alignment, repetition. Then we looked at fonts and typography. Now don't miss our third video in which we're going to apply these techniques to designing PowerPoint presentations.